There is a particular kind of relief that feels exactly like salvation, and it is the most dangerous feeling a lost person can have. You meet someone, and when they speak, the noise in your head goes quiet. Their words seem to land with a weight your own thoughts have never carried. For the first time in months, maybe years, you are not the one who has to decide. And somewhere in that relief, without ceremony, without a single moment you could point to later, you hand over the one thing no one can ever hand back to you. Carl Jung mapped the exact figure that does this to us. Not a con man, not a manipulator, often a genuinely wise person, an older voice, a teacher whose understanding really is deeper than yours. That is what makes it lethal. The mentor whose wisdom feels like rescue can become the most dangerous relationship of your life, because the moment his voice replaces your own, you have gone to sleep inside another man's mind, and you will call it learning. You will call it humility. You will call it finally finding the answer. You will not call it what it is until you wake up one day and discover you can no longer make a single move without asking permission from a man who never asked for that power. By the end of this, you will understand the inner figure Jung called the wise old man, why your psyche keeps producing him, why you keep meeting him out in the world wearing a face and a name. You will understand the gift he carries, and the precise way that gift becomes a cage. You will learn to recognize the moment the guidance stops waking you and starts owning you, and you will learn the one thing the real teacher always does that the false one never will. And there is a harder part, the part Jung would have you sit with, which is that the cage is never built by the teacher. It is always, every time, built by the part of you that was desperate not to have to carry your own life. Before we go down into this, take whatever rises in you and put it somewhere you can find it again. If you have ever handed your judgment to someone whose certainty felt like ground under your feet, leave a word in the comments about who that was, not to expose them, but to name something you may have spent years not naming. If this is speaking to something you recognize, let that be known. And if there is someone in your life right now who is dissolving into a teacher, a guru, a mentor, a voice that has begun to do their thinking for them, send this to them quietly. Some doors a person can only be shown. They still have to walk through alone. That is the whole point of what we are about to learn. Picture a young man at 29, sitting in an empty office at 2 in the morning. The company he poured the entire decade of his 20s into has just died, not dramatically. There was no scandal, no betrayal, no single catastrophe he could blame. It simply ran out of air, the way most things do, slowly and then all at once. And now he is sitting among the dark monitors and the chairs no one will sit in again. And he is realizing that he no longer knows who he is. The company was not his job. It was his identity, his answer to every question a stranger might ask him at a party. The proof that the boy who was never quite enough had become a man who was. And now the proof is gone, and underneath it there is nothing he recognizes. He does not feel grief exactly. He feels unmade. This is the condition Jung understood as the doorway. Not the failure itself, but the hollowness after it. The moment when the structure you built to know yourself has collapsed and you are standing in the rubble with no map. In that exact condition, the psyche does something ancient and automatic. It begins to search for the one who knows. Jung observed that when a person is genuinely lost, when the conscious ego has run out of answers and humbly admits it, an image rises from the deepest layer of the mind, the image of an older figure who carries meaning, a sage, a guide, a grandfather of the soul who seems to stand on the far side of the confusion, holding the very thing you have lost. Jung called this figure the wise old man. He is one of the great archetypes, which means he is not something you learned. He is a pattern built into the human psyche itself, the way the instinct to nurse is built into an infant. Across every culture that has ever existed, in the myths of peoples who never met, the same figure appears at the same moment in the story. The hero is lost in the forest, defeated, out of strength, and an old man steps from behind a tree, Merlin to the young king. The hermit on the mountain the seeker climbs for years to find. The mentor in every story you have ever loved, who appears precisely when the young hero has nothing left, and hands him the sword, the word, the secret that turns the whole tale. Jung's point was startling in its simplicity. We did not invent this figure for our stories. We tell this story because the figure lives in us, and he appears, predictably, at the hour of our deepest helplessness. So the young man, unmade in his dark office, is in exactly the psychological state that summons the wise old man, and the archetype, once activated, does not stay politely inside. It reaches out into the world looking for something to land on. It searches the people around you for a hook to hang itself on, and the instant it finds someone who fits the shape, even loosely, it pours the whole archetypal force onto that ordinary human being. This is the mechanism Jung spent his life studying, and it is the hinge on which this entire story turns. The lost man does not consciously decide to worship anyone. His unconscious finds a candidate and dresses him, without permission, in the robes of the eternal sage. The candidate arrives a few weeks later. An older man, late 60s, who had built and sold several companies and now spent his time, as he put it, talking to people who reminded him of himself 30 years ago. They meet at a dinner the young man almost did not attend, and when the older man speaks, something happens that the young man has no framework for. Every sentence seems to carry a strange gravity. The man says ordinary things, things the young man might have read in any book, but coming from this mouth, in this voice, they feel like they are being handed down rather than merely spoken. The young man drives home that night feeling, for the first time since the company died, that the ground beneath him is solid. He does not know that the solidity is not in the older man at all. He has met someone who fits the shape, and his own unconscious has just lit that man up from the inside like a lamp behind paper. Here is what nobody tells you about that first meeting, and it is the gift before it becomes the trap. The wise old man is real, and his function is sacred. The archetype exists for a reason. When you are truly lost, you genuinely cannot find your own way with the resources you have, because the resources you have are exactly what got you lost. You need an injection of meaning from a layer of the psyche deeper than your exhausted conscious mind. The figure of the sage is the psyche's own method of delivering that meaning, of saying to the drowning ego, there is a wisdom older than your panic, and here is its voice. The mentor who appears at the right moment, the teacher whose words rearrange you, the dream of the old man who hands you a single sentence you wake up clutching. These are not malfunctions. They are the soul's medicine, and for a while, that medicine saves the young man's life. He begins to meet the older man weekly. He brings his confusion and leaves with clarity. The mentor does not give advice exactly. He asks questions, tells stories, points at things the young man had not noticed, and the young man begins, slowly, to rebuild. He starts a new venture. He makes decisions again. He sleeps. From the outside, this is a beautiful thing. A young man saved by an older one, the oldest story we have. And if it stopped here, it would be the story of every good mentorship that ever lifted a person out of a pit. But the archetype that saved him does not know when to stop, because the archetype has no limits of its own. The limits have to come from the young man, and the young man, still terrified of the empty office, does not want limits. He wants to never feel unmade again. So he begins to ask the mentor about everything. At first, it is the business which is reasonable. Then it is which apartment to take. Then whether to end a relationship. Then what he should think about a book he read before he has finished deciding what he thinks. He notices, somewhere in the back of his mind, that he has stopped having opinions and started having questions to bring to the older man. But noticing it feels like ingratitude, so he buries the noticing. The relief of not having to be the final authority on his own life is so total, so physically soothing, that he protects it. He has found a place to set down a weight he has carried since childhood, and he is not about to pick it back up to satisfy some abstract principle about independence. This is the turn, and it is so quiet you could miss it. The mentor has not changed. He is the same man, offering the same kind of attention he always did. What has changed is invisible and total. The young man has stopped consulting a wise person and started outsourcing his soul. He has done what Jung warned about with particular gravity, because Jung had watched it destroy people he respected. He has projected the wise old man, the inner figure of his own deepest wisdom, so completely onto an outer human being that he no longer believes the wisdom lives anywhere but in that other man. And once you believe that, once you are certain the answers are out there in someone else and not in here in you, you will defend that arrangement against anything, including your own freedom. Because the alternative is to walk back into the empty office and be unmade all over again. Now we have to go down to where this really comes from, because the office, the failure, the mentor, these are only the surface. Jung found, again and again, that the figure we hand our authority to in adulthood is standing in a doorway that was cut long before we ever met him. To understand why this young man dissolved so eagerly into an older man's certainty, you have to go back to a smaller room, decades earlier, and look at a boy and his father. The father was not cruel. That is the part that confuses people, because we expect the wound to look like a wound. The father was certain about everything. He was a man who had answers, who delivered judgments at the dinner table like a court handing down rulings, and who made it quietly, devastatingly clear that the boy's own developing opinions were charming but not yet to be taken seriously. There was always a right answer, and the right answer always lived in the father. The boy learned, the way children learn the things that shape them most, not through any single event, but through 10,000 small ones, that his job was not to know, but to be guided. That thinking for himself was a kind of risk, and that the safest, warmest, most loved place to stand was just behind a powerful man, agreeing. He learned that certainty was something other people had and gave to you, and that the way to be safe was to find someone who had it and stay close. This is the childhood root, and Jung would say it with great care, because it is the most human thing in the world and the hardest to forgive in yourself. The boy did not fail to develop his own inner authority because he was weak. He failed to develop it because developing it was dangerous, and not developing it was rewarded with love. Every child does the arithmetic that keeps him close to the people he needs. This boy calculated, correctly, that his own voice was a liability and a strong man's approval was survival. He grew up with what I would call a hollow throne, the seat of his own judgment, The inner authority that should have grown sturdy through years of being trusted to be wrong and try again was never built. The throne room is there. The throne is there. But no one was ever allowed to sit in it, so it sits empty, waiting, and the man spends his life looking for someone qualified enough to fill it. And now you can see the whole machine. The company was the young man's first attempt to fill the throne himself, to become the certain father, to be the one with the answers. And when it died, the throne did not just empty. It revealed that it had always been empty, that he had only ever been performing authority, never actually holding it. Of course, the wise old man came roaring up out of his unconscious. Of course, he found the nearest qualified older man and crowned him on the spot. He was not finding a mentor. He was finding, at last, someone worthy to sit in a throne he had been forbidden from sitting in since he was small. The relief he felt was not the relief of being taught. It was the relief of a man who has been carrying a crown he was never allowed to wear, finally handing it to someone he believes deserves it. Here is the part that made Jung's work on this so unsettling, and it is the darkest turn in the whole story. The danger is not that the mentor is a villain. In the cleanest, most tragic version of this trap, the mentor is genuinely good, genuinely wise, and wants nothing but the young man's growth. The cage gets built anyway. It gets built because a sufficiently lost person can take even true wisdom and use it to fall asleep. Jung saw this with a particular sorrow because he had been on both ends of it. He had idolized Freud as exactly this figure, the older master who held the truth, and he had spent years dissolving his own judgment into Freud's system before the break that nearly destroyed him taught him what that surrender had cost. And later, Jung found himself becoming the wise old man for others, watched students hand him their souls, and understood that the gravest thing a teacher can do is accept that gift. The student who worships you is not learning from you. He is using you to avoid the terror of becoming himself. So the young man, 2 years in, is a man who functions beautifully and owns nothing of his own life. He is successful again. He is calm. And he cannot buy a car, take a job, or trust a feeling without first running it through the older man. He has what I would call a borrowed spine. From the outside, he stands upright, decisive, impressive. But the uprightness is not his. It is structural support on permanent loan from another nervous system. And he knows, in the place where we keep the things we refuse to look at, that if the older man died tomorrow, he would collapse like a tent with its pole pulled out. He is not free. He is held up. And a man who is held up will do anything, betray anyone, abandon any truth, to keep the thing that holds him in place. There is a deeper structure under all of this that Jung mapped, and it explains why the young man, of all the things he could have surrendered to an old man specifically. Jung saw the psyche as a field of opposites in tension, and one of the oldest pairs is the eternal youth and the old man, what the old alchemists called the pure and the senex. The pure is the spirit of beginning, of possibility, of the leap, the part of us that is all wings and no roots, brilliant and weightless, and allergic to commitment. The senex is the opposite pole, the spirit of structure, of patience, of weight and law and the long view, the part that knows time and builds slowly and can sit still. A whole person needs both, holds both, lets the youth's fire be disciplined by the elder's structure, and the elder's rigidity be thawed by the youth's fire. But when a person lives only at one pole, the other pole does not disappear. It goes underground, and the more it is exiled, the more violently the psyche craves it. The young man had been pure his entire adult life. The company, the speed, the next thing. The conviction that potential was the same as achievement. The boy his father never let mature, now grown into a man addicted to beginning and terrified of the slow weight of finishing. He had no senex in him. He had exiled the whole structure-building, patient, grounded pole because it looked too much like his father's suffocating certainty. So when the company died and the pure's wings finally failed him, the missing pole came roaring back, not as a part of himself where it belonged, but projected whole onto an old man. He did not just find a mentor. He found his own missing weight, his own exiled senex, walking around outside him wearing a stranger's body. And he fell on it like a starving man because he had spent 30 years refusing to grow it in himself. This is the law Jung kept finding. What you will not develop within, you will worship without. And the senex has a shadow, which the young man could not see while he was kneeling. The wise old man, when he turns dark, does not become a villain. He becomes a tyrant of certainty, a figure so sure, so settled, so finished, that he can no longer learn anything. And he subtly forbids growth in everyone around him, because growth is change, and he has decided change is beneath him. The shadow of the sage is the man who has stopped asking questions and started only delivering verdicts, the elder who confuses being old with being right. The young man's father had been exactly this, the senex in its shadow form, certainty as a weapon. And in choosing his mentor, the young man had been lucky, because the mentor carried the senex in something closer to its light. But the young man's hunger was so total that he would have knelt just as readily before the dark version, before a charismatic tyrant who would have used the worship to feed himself. The lost do not check the credentials of the one they crown. They are not choosing wisely. They are fleeing the throne, desperate not to sit in it themselves. Let me show you how this looks when the screen is not a businessman, but a guru, because the same mechanism runs at every scale. Think of a woman in her 40s who found, after a divorce that hollowed her out, a spiritual teacher whose presence seemed to dissolve her suffering on contact. At first, it was the most healing thing that had ever happened to her. The teacher had real insight, a genuine stillness, words that reorganized her pain into meaning. But the same quiet turn happened. She stopped meditating to find her own center and started meditating to feel closer to his. She began to disbelieve her own experiences until he had confirmed them, to distrust any insight that arose in her unless it had his stamp on it. She gave the community her savings, then her time, then the very last thing, her own discernment, the inner instrument that might have told her when something had gone wrong. By the time the teacher's behavior turned genuinely exploitative, she no longer had the equipment to notice because she had handed him the very faculty that detects exploitation. She had crowned the wise old man so completely that there was no one left inside her to object. This is the trap at its most extreme, and it is the same trap exactly as the young man in the meeting. Only the costume of the teacher is different. The crisis, when it comes, is small, the way the real ones usually are. The young man has an idea, not a small one, a genuine, electric, original idea about a direction for his work, and for a moment, before he can stop it, he feels something he has not felt in years, the pure, uncontaminated certainty of his own mind. He knows this is right. He knows it the way you know your own name. And then, reflexively, the way a man reaches for a railing, he brings it to the mentor. And the mentor, who is not a villain, but is also only a man, does not see it. tells him gently that it is probably a distraction, that he should stay the course. And the young man feels the certainty drain out of him, feels his own clear knowing dissolve under the weight of the older voice, and agrees, says, "You're right, thanks." Buries the best idea he has had in a decade because a man he crowned could not see it. That night he does not sleep, and he does not know why. There is a wrongness in his body he cannot name. A low animal distress, like an organ, has been removed. Jung would recognize it instantly. This is the psyche protesting its own betrayal. The self, the deeper center of him, had spoken clearly in its own voice for the first time in years, and he had silenced it for the comfort of the borrowed spine. The body always knows when you have abandoned yourself. The body keeps a record the ego refuses to read. And the young man lies in the dark with the record playing, the unread file finally too loud to ignore, and he begins, against everything in him, to ask a different question. Not what does the mentor think, but why am I so afraid to find out what I think? This is the threshold, and crossing it is the whole work. It does not feel like liberation. It feels like ingratitude, like betrayal, like the floor opening. To begin withdrawing the projection, to begin pulling the wise old man back off the outer human and back into yourself where he belongs, you have to first survive the terror that without the borrowed certainty you are nothing. You have to walk back into the empty office. Jung was unflinching about this. He said that what is not made conscious will run your life and you will call it fate. The young man had to make conscious the thing he had spent his whole life avoiding, which was that the certainty he kept seeking in fathers and mentors and gurus was never going to be installed from outside. It could only be grown from inside, slowly, through the unbearable practice of trusting his own judgment and being willing to be wrong. And this is where Jung's vision becomes genuinely freeing, because the answer is not to fire the mentor and storm off into a lonely, defended self-reliance. That would be its own trap, the orphan's trap, the man who trusts no one because he once trusted too much. The work is subtler and more demanding than that. The young man has to learn to do two things at once that feel like opposites. He has to receive the older man's genuine wisdom, the real gift, which is real, while refusing to surrender his own throne to the man who carries it. He has to take the guidance and keep the authority. He has to let the mentor be a mentor, which means a voice that informs his decision, and stop letting him be a god, which means a voice that replaces it. So he does the harder thing. He keeps meeting the older man, but something inside the meetings has changed. He brings his thinking already half-formed instead of empty. He disagrees, the first few times with his heart pounding like he is committing a crime, and discovers that the mentor, the real one, is not threatened by it, is, in fact, pleased by it, has been waiting for it, because a good teacher is bored by a disciple and lit up by a peer. The young man learns to ask himself the question first, to sit in his own discomfort and produce his own answer, however shaky, before he ever brings it to the older man for refinement. He is moving the figure home. Every time he trusts his own knowing and survives, the throne in him gets a little less hollow, the spine a little more his own. He is not rejecting the wise old man. He is doing what Jung said was the entire point. He is learning to find the old man inside. And Jung gave a practice for exactly this, a method he called active imagination, which is less mystical than it sounds. The young man, on the advice of someone who knew Jung's work, began to do something that felt absurd the first time and then did not. He sat in a quiet room and deliberately called up the figure of the wise elder, not the mentor, not his father, but the archetype itself, the inner old man. And he began to ask him questions directly, not on paper to bring to another human for grading, but in the privacy of his own mind, addressed to the part of himself that carried the weight he had been projecting outward for years. At first there was nothing, only his own self-conscious narration. Then, slowly, the figure began to answer in a voice that was unmistakably not his ego's chatter, a voice with the same gravity he had been chasing in the mentor, except now it was rising from inside him. He understood, with a shock that took weeks to fully land, that the meaning he had knelt for in other men had a source in him, that the well was in his own yard, that he had walked past it every day on his way to beg water from his neighbor. The mentor had been a real and kind neighbor, but the young man had a well. This is the integration, and it is not a single victory, but a practice he will return to for the rest of his life, because the pull to hand his throne away will never fully vanish. The pure in him will always, in moments of fear, want to find a stronger man and dissolve. The work is not to kill that part. The work is to feel the pull, to recognize it the instant it begins, the slight leaning, the reflex to ask before he has tried to answer, and to choose again and again to consult the well before he consults the neighbor. He keeps the mentor. He keeps every good teacher he will ever meet. He just stops confusing any of them with the source. And that single distinction is the difference between a man who is being raised and a man who has been buried alive in someone else's certainty and called it being saved. Because here is the truth this whole story has been moving toward. The wise old man was never out there. The mentor was only ever a screen, lit from within by the young man's own deepest wisdom projected onto him. Everything that felt so weighty and true in the older man's words, the gravity, the meaning, the sense of standing on solid ground, that was the young man's own buried authority, glimpsed in a mirror and mistaken for someone else's possession. The whole tragedy of the trap is that he spent years kneeling before another man to receive a gift that was, the entire time, his own, exiled and projected outward because a small boy once learned it was too dangerous to keep at home. The mentor's real and final gift, the one the good ones always give, was not an answer. It was the day the young man no longer needed one. There is a test you can run on any guide, outer or inner, any teacher, any voice that has begun to carry weight in your life. And it is the cleanest line Jung's work draws through this whole territory. Ask what the relationship is making of you. The false guide, even the well-meaning one, even the genuinely wise one, makes you smaller, makes you more dependent, makes the distance between his certainty and your confusion wider with every meeting, so that you need him more next month than you did last month. The true guide makes you larger. He hands you back to yourself. His entire secret aim, whether he says it or not, is to become unnecessary, to work himself out of a job, to point so persistently at the throne inside you that one day you stop looking at him and finally sit down. The real teacher does not want disciples. He wants to be the last person you ever needed in that seat. The young man understood this. In the end, on an ordinary afternoon, when he realized he had not asked the older man's permission for anything in months, and the older man had never once mentioned it, the relationship had quietly changed shape. Two men talking now, one older and one younger, both holding their own thrones, the wisdom flowing between them instead of down from one to the other. The young man still valued the older man enormously. He just no longer confused him with the source. He had stopped going to sleep inside another mind and woken up inside his own. and he found to his quiet astonishment that the certainty he had chased in other men his whole life had been growing in him the entire time he was busy trusting himself, the way a plant grows in a room you forgot to check on. So if there is an old voice in your life right now whose every word feels like ground under your feet, here is the question to hold, and write it in the comments if you are willing to say it out loud, not as a complaint about anyone, but as a line you are holding yourself to. Whose certainty have I been living inside? And what would I have to risk to find out what I actually think? Notice that the question is not whether to leave the teacher. The question is whether you are using the teacher to grow or to sleep. There is all the difference in the world between a voice that wakes you and a voice you have crawled inside of to avoid being awake. And do not let anyone, including yourself, sell you the lonely version of the cure. The work is not to need no one. The work is to receive everything a true guide offers and keep the throne, to let the wisdom in and let the authority stay, the mentor, the teacher, the inner old man who appears in your dreams holding a single sentence. These are gifts, and the right response to the gift is not to worship the one who carries it and not to refuse it out of pride, but to take it home, to let it teach the sovereign in you to stand. The figure of wisdom was always meant to point past himself, back to the one place the answer could ever finally live, which is in you. You handed someone your judgment because once, long ago, in a room you did not choose, you learned that your own voice was a danger and someone else's certainty was safety. That was true then. The boy was right to do it, but you are not in that room anymore, and the throne that was forbidden to you is not forbidden now. And it has been sitting empty your whole life, not because you were unworthy of it, but because you were waiting for permission that was never going to arrive from outside. No one is coming to install your certainty. No teacher, no mentor, no guru, no old wise voice, however true. The real teacher does not want to rule you. He wants to wake the old voice that was already in you, the one that has known the way the entire time, the one you exiled when you were too small to keep it safe. The wisdom you knelt for was always yours. Stop looking for the one who knows. Become him. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.